You are lying in the grandest bed in a Florentine palazzo, the silken sheets a cool caress against your skin. The air, however, is not a clean, crisp Tuscan evening. It is thick with mingled scents, the heavy sweetness of civet and musk battling a far more personal and invasive odor, the undeniable smell of an unwashed human body that has not known a full bath in months. The person beside you, a celebrated beauty whose portrait hangs in the Uffizi, smiles, revealing teeth that are a mosaic of brown decay and missing gaps, her breath a wave of putrid air that makes your eyes water. You are told this is intimacy. You are told this is passion. But as you look closer, you see the subtle track marks of lice in the roots of her elaborately powdered hair and notice the faint, sweet, rotting fruit smell of the syphilitic chancre hidden by a velvet beauty patch on her cheek. This is not a nightmare. This is the baseline reality of desire in the Renaissance, a world where the most intimate act was a gamble against filth, disease, and a level of physical squalor that we can barely comprehend, a grotesque ballet of public splendor and private putrescence. This was not an isolated horror confined to the desperate or the poor, but the very fabric of life for kings and queens, popes and poets, the celebrated figures we see rendered in marble and oil, frozen in an eternal, sanitized glory. The Renaissance was an era of explosive creativity, of divine art and profound philosophical shifts, but it was built upon a foundation of biological ignorance and human suffering that we have systematically scrubbed from the historical record. We celebrate the minds of Leonardo and Michelangelo, but we ignore the stench of the world they inhabited, a world where the simple act of being close to another human being was an act of profound and often dangerous sensory endurance. We have been sold a lie of perfumed courtiers and romantic trysts, when the reality was a clinical, often brutal, negotiation with the frailties and failures of the unhygienic human body. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Let us begin with the most fundamental assault on Renaissance intimacy, the overwhelming, inescapable reality of scent. The modern obsession with sterility and deodorization would have been seen as a bizarre, even pathological, affliction to the people of the 15th and 16th centuries. Theirs was a world saturated in odors, and the human body was the primary contributor. Full-body bathing was a rarity, often considered a medical risk that opened the pores to miasma and pestilence. The wealthy would change their linen undergarments, believing that the clean cloth would absorb the body's impurities, a process known as dry washing. But this did little to combat the foundational layer of sweat, sebum, a bacteria that was a constant companion. The court of King James I of England was infamous for its ripe atmosphere, with one contemporary, Sir John Harington, lamenting the foul and filthy state of the courtiers, whose fine silks and velvets concealed bodies that were seldom washed. Intimacy in such an environment was not a discovery of another's clean scent, but a navigation of their personal miasma, a complex bouquet of stale sweat, unwashed hair, and the underlying notes of their diet and digestion. Perfumes were not used to create a pleasant aroma, but as a form of olfactory warfare against the body's natural state. These are not the light, floral scents of today. They were heavy, aggressive, animalistic concoctions designed to bludgeon the senses into submission. Musk, harvested from the glandular sacs of the musk deer. Civet, a fecal paste scraped from the perineal glands of the civet cat. And ambergris, a waxy, pungent substance harvested from the digestive system of sperm whales, with the foundational notes of high-status perfume. These scents, thick, cloying, and fecal in their raw state, were mixed with spices and oils and slathered onto skin, hair, and clothing. The goal was to create a personal cloud of scents so powerful that it overwhelmed not only one's own body odor, but but also the general stench of the surrounding world, a world of open sewers, animal dung, and ever-present decay. An intimate encounter was therefore a collision of two heavily armed olfactory fortresses, a mingling of expensive animal secretions designed to mask the simple, unglamorous truth of human filth. The mouth, often considered a primary vessel of intimate expression, was in the Renaissance a source of profound horror. Dental hygiene was a grotesque pantomime of modern practice. The prevailing medical theory, inherited from antiquity, was that tooth decay was caused by tiny tooth worms that burrowed into the enamel. To combat these phantom creatures, people used abrasive powders made from brick dust, crushed coral, or burnt alum, which scoured away not just the plaque, but the protective enamel itself, accelerating decay. The wealthy might have their servants rub their teeth with a linen cloth, but the result was almost universally the same: chronic and painful abscesses, rampant decay, and pervasive, overpowering halitosis. Queen Elizabeth I, for all her power and majesty, was known to have teeth that were blackened and rotten, a consequence of her love for sugary treats. A foreign ambassador once noted that her speech was difficult to understand due to the number of missing teeth, and one can only imagine the odor that accompanied her royal pronouncements. A kiss in this era was not an act of simple affection, but a brave foray into a cavern of decay, a direct confrontation with the scent of rotting dentin and infected gums. This general state of uncleanliness made the human body a thriving ecosystem for parasites. Body lice, or cooties, were not a sign of poverty, but a fact of life, living in the seams of clothing and feeding on their human hosts. Fleas were equally ubiquitous. Even the most lavishly appointed beds were often infested, leading to the creation of flea furs, a stole made from the pelt of a marten or ferret, which was draped over the shoulders. The theory was that the fleas would be attracted to the warmth of the fur, abandoning the human host. Imagine the absurdity: preparing for an intimate encounter not by washing, but by strategically deploying a dead animal on your person to act as a decoy for the insects you both knew were crawling on your bodies. The constant scratching, the red welts, the potential for diseases like typhus transmitted by lice. This was the mundane, irritating, and entirely unsexy backdrop to every moment of physical closeness. The shared bed was not a sanctuary of privacy, but a shared hunting ground for vermin. For women, the cycle of menstruation was shrouded in a fog of medical ignorance and superstitious dread. Lacking disposable sanitary products, women relied on folded pieces of linen or wool, known as rags or clouts, which were washed and reused. The process was inevitably messy, uncomfortable, and odorous. Medical texts of the period, written exclusively by men, portrayed menstrual blood as a venomous, polluting substance. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder's ancient claims were still widely believed, that a menstruating woman could turn wine sour, cause crops to wither, and make dogs go mad. This created a profound psychological and social barrier around a natural bodily function. A woman was seen as unclean and dangerous during her menses, and intimacy was often forbidden, not for reasons of comfort or hygiene, but out of a genuine, superstitious fear of contamination. The very biology of womanhood was pathologized, turning a part of the intimate cycle into a source of shame and revulsion. The ultimate consequence of this widespread squalor was that disease itself had a scent, and it was a common element in the intimate landscape. The pockmarked face of the smallpox survivor was a common sight, but the smell of an active infection, a unique, sweetish, cloying odor, was the smell of death lingering in a household. Gangrene, a frequent result of even minor injuries in a world without antibiotics, had a putrid, overpowering stench that filled a room, a scent that meant a lover or spouse was literally rotting while still alive. But the most terrifying of all was the new plague sweeping across Europe, a disease that directly and grotesquely targeted the organs of intimacy: syphilis. The Great Pox, as it was known, announced its presence with genital sores, but its later stages produced a symphony of horrors: ulcerating lesions, known as gummas, would eat away at soft tissue and bone, most famously causing the collapse of the nasal bridge, resulting in a saddle nose that was the telltale sign of a long-term sufferer. The sick gave off a foul, necrotic odor, a combination of decaying tissue and the metallic stench of the primary treatment, mercury. The cure for syphilis was, in many ways, as horrific as the disease itself. Patients were subjected to mercury rubs, mercury steam baths, and even ingested mercury compounds. This induced a state of extreme, grotesque salivation, which was believed to be the body expelling the disease. Sufferers would drool uncontrollably, sometimes producing pints of saliva a day, a foul-smelling fluid thick with the poison. The side effects were catastrophic. Their teeth would loosen and fall out, their gums would ulcerate, and many suffered severe neurological damage, descending into madness. The phrase, "one night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," became a grim summary of the era's sexual calculus. An intimate encounter could lead to a slow, disfiguring, and agonizing death, where the individual's body and mind were dissolved by both the disease and its supposed cure. The scent of mercury, sharp and metallic like copper pennies, became intertwined with the scent of sex and desire, a constant, poisonous reminder of the stakes involved. Intimacy, for the ruling classes, was rarely a matter of private desire. It was a public and political duty, a high-stakes performance with the stability of a kingdom on the line. The production of a male heir was the single most important function of a royal marriage, and the process was stripped of all privacy and romance. The consummation of a royal wedding was often a public or semi-public event. After the ceremony, the bride and groom would be ceremonially put to bed by a crowd of high-ranking courtiers, who would offer crude jokes and fertility blessings before the curtains were drawn. In some cases, witnesses remained to ensure the marriage was, in fact, consummated, a legal necessity to make the union binding. The pressure on a young couple, often teenagers who were virtual strangers, to perform the most intimate of acts under such scrutiny is difficult to overstate. It was not an act of love, but of dynastic strategy, a clinical deposit of seed to secure a bloodline. The case of Henry VIII of England and his 6 wives is the most infamous example of this royal reproductive obsession. His entire reign, and the course of English history, was dictated by his desperate quest for a son. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was a long, agonizing saga of miscarriages, stillbirths, and the birth of a single, politically inconvenient daughter, Mary. The intimate life of the king and queen became a matter of state debate. Was Catherine's body flawed? Was the king cursed? Was their union, based on his marriage to his brother's widow, biblically illegitimate and therefore barren? Their bedchamber was not a private space, but the central theater of a national crisis. When Henry broke with the Catholic Church to Mary and Boleyn, he was gambling an entire kingdom on her fertility. Her failure to produce a son, delivering only another daughter, Elizabeth, was not just a personal disappointment. It was treason. Her execution was the ultimate and most brutal consequence of a perceived intimate failure. The king's subsequent marriages were a frantic, accelerating cycle of hope and despair. Each new wife's body a vessel for the king's dynastic ambitions, to be discarded when it failed to perform its biological duty. When natural conception failed, the wealthy would turn to a terrifying and bizarre pharmacopoeia of fertility treatments, a testament to the desperation that underpinned the quest for an heir. These cures were a grotesque fusion of folk magic and humoral theory. A woman might be instructed to drink concoctions made from powdered boar's testicles or the ashes of a rabbit's womb. Poultices made from animal dung and herbs were applied to the abdomen to warm the uterus. The 16th century French surgeon Ambrose Père, while more advanced than many of his contemporaries, still recorded supposed remedies that beggar belief, such as consuming the matrix of a hair. The belief in sympathetic magic was pervasive. To encourage fertility, one must consume the reproductive organs of fertile animals. These were not fringe beliefs, but mainstream medical advice, prescribed by the most respected physicians of the day. The intimate lives of infertile couples were invaded by these repulsive and utterly useless rituals, a constant, desperate, and often disgusting attempt to force the body into compliance with dynastic demands. If conception was achieved, the next ordeal was childbirth, an event that was less a celebration of new life and more a terrifying brush with death. For women, the birthing chamber was a battlefield from which many would not return. The process was a communal, female-dominated affair, with a midwife, female relatives, and neighbors all present in the lying-in room. This was not for comfort, but for necessity. Births were long, agonizing, and fraught with danger. A baby in the breech position or prolonged labor could easily become a death sentence for both mother and child. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a bacterial infection of the genital tract after birth, was a rampant and mysterious killer. In a world without an understanding of germ theory, the unwashed hands of midwives and assistants, moving from one birth to the next, spread infection with lethal efficiency. A woman would survive the physical trauma of delivery only to succumb days later to a raging fever, her body consumed by an invisible enemy introduced during her most vulnerable moment. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies and traumatic births was immense and horrifyingly public. One of the most common and devastating complications was uterine prolapse, where the muscles of the pelvic floor, torn and weakened by childbirth, would fail, allowing the uterus to descend and sometimes even protrude from the body. Another horror was the vesicovaginal fistula, a tear between the bladder and the vaginal wall caused by a prolonged and obstructed labor. A woman with this condition would leak urine uncontrollably for the rest of her life, making her a social outcast, condemned to a life of shame and the constant stench of ammonia. These were not rare occurrences, but the common, devastating risks of motherhood. The joys of maternity were paid for with a currency of torn flesh, chronic pain, and permanent, humiliating disfigurement. The bodies of women, particularly those in royal or aristocratic lines who were expected to produce numerous children, were often anatomical wreckages by the time they reached middle age, their private suffering a testament to the brutal mechanics of pre-modern obstetrics. Marriage in the Renaissance had little to do with the modern ideals of love, companionship, or mutual respect. It was, first and foremost, a contract, an economic and political alliance between two families. The bride was a piece of property, a vessel for a dowry, and a womb for a future heir. The concept of romantic love as a prerequisite for marriage was a poetic fantasy, not a social reality. Girls were often betrothed in childhood and married as soon as they reached the legal age of consent, which was typically 12 for girls and 14 for boys. The psychological and physical trauma of a 12-year-old girl being delivered to the bed of a much older man, a complete stranger, was simply not a consideration. Her duty was to submit, and the law provided her with no recourse. The legal framework of marriage rendered the wife the possession of her husband. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband upon marriage. She could not own property, sign contracts, or sue in court. This legal subjugation extended to the most intimate aspects of her life. The concept of marital rape was legally and socially incomprehensible. A husband was entitled to his conjugal rights whenever he desired them, and a wife's refusal was seen as a violation of the marriage contract, a form of theft of what was rightfully his. The popular text, The Law's Resolutions of Women's Rights from 1632, explicitly stated that a husband's physical discipline of his wife was legally permissible. While societal norms might frown upon excessive brutality, the fundamental principle of a husband's ownership of his wife's body was unquestioned. The marriage bed, for many women, was not a place of intimacy, but of legally sanctioned servitude. While heterosexual marriage was a rigid institution of property and procreation, other forms of sexuality existed in the shadows, under the constant threat of brutal punishment. Sodomy, a term that covered a wide range of non-procreative sexual acts, including homosexual relations, was a capital crime in most of Europe, punishable by burning at the stake. Yet, This did not stop its practice, particularly in the male-dominated environments of artistic workshops, universities, and clerical communities. Renaissance Florence was notorious for its thriving homosexual subculture, so much so that the German word for a sodomite was Florenzer. The authorities established a special court, the Officers of the Night, specifically to prosecute these crimes. They operated on a system of anonymous accusations dropped into a box, leading to a climate of fear, blackmail, and paranoia. Even the great Leonardo da Vinci was twice anonymously accused of sodomy as a young man, a charge that could have ended his career and his life. He was acquitted, but the threat lingered, a stark reminder of the violent hypocrisy of an era that publicly condemned what it privately practiced. In a world where a woman's primary value lay in her fertility, the inability to control that fertility was a source of constant anxiety. For the married woman, another pregnancy could mean death in childbirth. For the unmarried woman, it meant social ruin, destitution, and shame. Yet, reliable contraception did not exist. People resorted to a desperate and ineffective blend of folk remedies and magical thinking. Coitus interruptus, or spilling the seed, was the most common method, but its reliability was, and is, notoriously poor. Women would use sponges soaked in vinegar or acidic fruit juices, inserted into the vagina, with the hope that the acidic environment would kill the sperm. Amulets were worn, such as those made from the genitals of a weasel, in the belief they would magically prevent conception. These methods offered little more than a psychological placebo against the overwhelming tide of biology. When these flimsy defenses failed, women would turn to the dark and dangerous world of abortion. Lacking any clinical methods, they relied on herbal abortifacients, powerful and toxic plants that could induce uterine contractions. Herbs like savon, pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were known for their potent effects, but dosage was a deadly game of guesswork. An insufficient dose would do nothing, while a slightly larger dose could cause not only a miscarriage, but also violent convulsions, organ failure, and a painful death for the woman. Midwives and wise women who provided these herbs operated in secret, under the constant threat of being accused of witchcraft if something went wrong. Abortion was a desperate, life-threatening gamble undertaken by women with no other options, a hidden slaughterhouse operating behind the respectable facade of Renaissance society. The historical record is largely silent on the scale of this practice, but the frequency with which these herbs are mentioned in contemporary herbals and medical texts suggests it was a common, if whispered about, tragedy. The darkest consequence of unwanted pregnancy was infanticide. In an era with no social safety net for unmarried mothers and their children, a baby born out of wedlock was often a death sentence for both. The discovery of the tiny corpses of newborns in rivers, cesspits, and ditches was a grimly common feature of Renaissance urban life. While the act was condemned by both church and state, authorities often struggled to prosecute it. It was a crime born of utter desperation. Some cities, recognizing the scale of the problem, established foundling hospitals, such as the famous Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, where a desperate mother could anonymously leave her child in the hope of it being cared for by the church or state. These institutions were overwhelmed, with mortality rates inside them often exceeding 50%. They were a testament to the brutal reality that for many, the act of intimacy led directly to a choice between social ruin and the death of a child. The very understanding of sexuality was filtered through the bizarre and arcane lens of humoral theory. The human body was believed to contain 4 primary fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance between these humors. Sexual activity was seen as a crucial mechanism for managing this balance, particularly for men. Semen was believed to be a refined form of blood, and its periodic release through intercourse was considered necessary to prevent a dangerous buildup, or plethora, that could lead to aggression, madness, or disease. For men, sex was often framed not as an act of pleasure, but as a necessary medical treatment, a form of therapeutic bleeding. Female pleasure, on the other hand, was a subject of intense debate and suspicion. While some physicians believed that a woman's orgasm was necessary for conception, as it was thought to release a female seed, others saw female desire as a sign of a dangerously hot and moist humoral constitution, linking it to hysteria and moral corruption. A woman's pleasure was therefore conditional, medically necessary in some contexts, but a sign of pathology in others. This medicalized view of sex created a social paradox. While female desire was suspect, a wife's refusal to engage in intercourse could be seen as medically harmful to her husband. It was her duty to provide him with this therapeutic release. This framework stripped the act of its emotional and relational components, reducing it to a crude hydraulic exchange of bodily fluids, a necessary and clinical maintenance of the human machine. The erotic poetry of the era might speak of divine love and transcendent passion, but the medical texts that informed people's understanding of their own bodies spoke a different language, a language of pressure, release, plethora, and purgation. The intimate act was caught between the lofty ideals of Petrarchan sonnets and the crude, mechanical realities of Galenic medicine. The rise of the printing press in the late 15th century unleashed a torrent of new ideas, but it also enabled the unprecedented spread of pornography. Works like Pietro Aretino's I Sonetti Lussuriosi, or Sonnets of Lust, published in the 1520s, were a direct and shocking assault on the era's official morality. The sonnets described sexual acts with explicit, unapologetic detail, and they were accompanied by a series of engravings by Marcantonio Raimondi, based on designs by the master painter Giulio Romano, depicting 16 sexual positions. The work caused an immense scandal. The Pope ordered all copies destroyed, and both the engraver and the publisher were imprisoned. Yet, the work was wildly popular, endlessly copied, and circulated in secret. It revealed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of Renaissance society, a culture that demanded public piety while privately consuming graphic depictions of the very acts it condemned. This was not the chaste, idealized love of courtly romance, but a celebration of carnal, physical, and often transgressive sexuality, a hidden transcript of the era's true desires. Prostitution was an accepted and often legally regulated part of the urban landscape. It was seen as a necessary evil, a way to channel male lust that might otherwise be directed at respectable women or, even worse, toward sodomy. Large cities like Venice and Rome were famous for their vast populations of prostitutes, who were often subject to specific laws dictating where they could live, what they could wear, and when they could appear in public. There was a stark hierarchy within the trade. At the top were the courtesans, women who were often educated, accomplished in music and literature, and who moved in the highest circles of society. Figures like Veronica Franco in Venice were celebrated poets and influential figures, their wit and charm as much a part of their appeal as their physical beauty. Their lives offered a rare path to independence and influence for women, but it was a precarious existence. At the bottom were the street prostitutes, who lived lives of brutal poverty and violence, constantly at risk from disease, abuse, and the law. For all women in the trade, the risk of syphilis was a professional hazard that could end a career and a life in the most agonizing way imaginable. The brothel was the dark mirror of the marriage bed, another site where intimacy was transactional, clinical, and fraught with mortal danger. As the era progressed, the long-term consequences of this intimate world became etched onto the bodies of its most powerful figures. The story of the French King Charles VIII offers a chilling case study. His invasion of Italy in 1494 is credited by many historians with bringing the Great Pox back to France in epidemic form. But it was his own body that became a testament to the hidden dysfunctions of royalty. Charles was born with significant congenital abnormalities. He was physically frail, with an overlarge head and a strangely shaped body. More critically, his anatomical configuration made procreation a difficult and uncertain affair. Despite his marriage to and of Brittany, his attempts to produce a healthy heir were a catastrophic failure. He fathered 4 children, all of whom died in infancy, a series of devastating losses that left the Valois dynasty hanging by a thread. His court physicians, powerless against the realities of genetics and infant mortality, could only offer the usual useless concoctions and prayers. The king's private, physical failings had profound public consequences, destabilizing his kingdom and leaving a legacy of dynastic uncertainty. His death at the age of just 27, after accidentally hitting his head on a low doorway, was a bizarre and anticlimactic end for a monarch whose entire reign was overshadowed by the silent, intimate tragedy of his own dysfunctional body. The evidence of these private horrors was often buried with the dead, only to be rediscovered centuries later by archaeology and forensic science. The excavation of Renaissance-era graves has provided stark, physical proof of the stories told in medical texts. Skeletons are unearthed with the telltale signs of advanced syphilis, pitted skulls and tibiae, and the collapsed nasal cavities that mercury treatments failed to prevent. The bones of women show the physical stress of multiple births, with pelvic deformities and signs of chronic infections. Analysis of hair samples from the long dead can reveal lethal levels of mercury, the silent witness to a desperate and toxic cure. The bodies themselves have become historical documents, their pathologies telling a story of suffering that was deliberately omitted from the heroic chronicles written by their contemporaries. These silent skeletons speak more eloquently of the true nature of Renaissance intimacy than any romantic poem or idealized portrait. They are the final, irrefutable evidence of the pain, disease, and desperation that lurked beneath the era's glittering surface. Let us return, finally, to that Florentine bedchamber, to the air thick with the smell of civet and sickness. The scene is no longer just a grotesque curiosity. It is a profound historical statement. We see it now not as an aberration, but as the norm. The beauty of the Botticelli on the wall and the putrescence of the breath of the person in the bed are not contradictions. They are two sides of the same historical coin. The sublime intellectual achievements of the Renaissance were accomplished by people whose daily existence was a battle against filth, pain, and disease, whose understanding of their own bodies was a tapestry of fantasy and fear. Their world, for all its artistic genius, lacked the most basic foundations of what we now consider a humane existence: hygiene, antibiotics, and an understanding of consent. The grand narrative of history, with its focus on kings, battles, and artistic movements, is a sanitized fiction. The real, lived experience of the past is found in these forgotten details. In the stench of an unwashed crowd, the terror of the birthing bed, the metallic taste of a mercury cure, the silent despair of a woman facing an unwanted pregnancy. These stories of private suffering are not a footnote to history. They are the history. They reveal the dark irony of power, that a king who could command armies could be brought low by a microscopic spirochete, that a queen adorned in jewels could be made a pariah by a fistula. They remind us that our modern conceptions of privacy, love, and physical well-being are incredibly recent, fragile inventions, built upon centuries of hidden suffering. The final, haunting image of the Renaissance is not the smile of the Mona Lisa, but the skull of a syphilitic, its nasal cavity eaten away, a silent, grinning testament to the brutal realities of intimacy in a world that was both divine and deeply, grotesquely human.